the U.S. and becoming the president of the Confederacy. Most people don't know that Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War for the United States in the 1850s. But again, a lot of Southern politicians served as U.S. politicians prior to the war. Also, U.S. President John Tyler ends up becoming a senator for the Confederate Congress, which is often used as part of an argument to say that John Tyler was the worst president in U.S. history, which I don't know if I agree with that statement. But anyway, again, this is supposed to be about Braxton Bragg, so let's get back to him. Anyway, again, so Davis is the Secretary of War during the Franklin Pierce administration, and during this time, he actually implements a policy of reform in the U.S. Army. However, again, ironically, this is a type of reform that's going to end up hurting Braxton Bragg, who had been an advocate for, reforms in the U.S. Army for years. It had gotten him in trouble in the 1840s. And now all of a sudden there is a push for reform, but this time it's something that Bragg doesn't necessarily support, mostly because it's going to put him out of a job. See, at the time, the U.S. wanted to move towards modern rifled artillery, which means if you're moving towards modern rifled artillery, you have to get rid of your small smoothbore cannons that were being employed by Bragg's battery. So all of a sudden, the U.S. Army is moving to adopt new equipment that is going to make Bragg's job outdated and irrelevant. So his battery ends up getting disbanded in the mid 1850s. As a result, Bragg has to find a new position in the Army, and so they put him into a cavalry officer role, and he didn't like this one bit. He was an artillery commander. He had done artillery his entire Army career outside of his recruiting position that he had for a short time. He pretty much only served in artillery positions. He was an artillery officer. But now with the light artillery gone, he has to be put into a cavalry position. He doesn't like the change. He doesn't want to be a cavalry officer, so he decides that after 18 and a half years in the U.S. Army, he decides to resign his commission in January of 1856, little over 5 years prior to the beginning of the Civil War. He decides to purchase a plantation in the state of Louisiana because his wife had this aristocratic kind of lifestyle that she was used to at this point. Something that his officers' pay could support at the time. And so he decides he wants to keep his wife's standard of living up. And so he decides to take what money he's earned from his Army career, the money that he inherited from his his father's contracting business, and he ends up buying a plantation, a sugar plantation to be exact. During this period, he was also involved in local politics, which was pretty common for plantation owners to do. If you owned a plantation, that means you were a big property owner in the area. You had a pretty decently sized labor force, a pretty decently sized slave labor force, and it meant you had some kind of standing in the community. So it would behoove you to get involved in local politics. Sometimes you're kind of forced into those positions, and that was the case with Bragg. He ends up serving in some small local political positions, kind of like a town comptroller or something like that, those kinds of positions. He also assisted in the establishment of LSU, Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge, which at the time had a different name, and if I had to write it down, I can't remember. But it was I think it was like Louisiana State Seminary and Military Academy. It was called something like that, but it was meant to be, again, a cemetery and a military academy, a seminary and a military academy. I don't know why that tongue twisted me, but anyway, so they brought on Braxton Bragg when LSU was being founded because they wanted him to head up the foundation of the military academy side of the house. So that's why he was brought in, and he spent a lot of time doing that. He would give lectures at the seminary as well. He became friends with the guy who was in charge of that side of the house. Eventually, they had some kind of falling out. Couldn't remember what it was over. not really significant. So he's spending a lot of his time there, but he's spending most of his time devoted to the management of his sugar plantation. Now, this is the last thing I'll note before I end today's episode. Sugar plantations in the South were among some of the most grueling of any of the plantations. You often hear about cotton plantations or, other types, what else? Tobacco plantations. You often hear about those when you're studying the antebellum South and the issue of slavery. You often hear about, again, cotton and tobacco plantations. But sugar plantations were the hardest to work on, and Bragg's was no different. His slaves often worked 18-hour plus days, working far before the sun came up and far long after the sun went down. And he personally ran it with a what was called a military-like type of discipline. He ran a very tight ship. He brought over his same military leadership style that he had in the army, and he brought that to his plantation, of course. And he was much harsher on his slaves than he was on his fellow, his soldiers, his subordinates, during his time in the army. And so I just kind of wanted to note that, since we are talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the General Officer Corps, I would be remiss if I did not cover the very bad and very ugly side of Braxton Bragg, which was the fact that he was a slave owner, a particularly cruel one at that, and again, it gives you a glimpse into the kind of man that he was and the kind of man he's going to be during the Civil War. But that's it. That's all I have for today. When we pick it up in the next episode, which I hope to have out next week, we're going to be covering the actual generalship of Braxton Bragg, his time in the Civil War. I'm going to cover a little bit of the stuff leading up to the Civil War, and then going, his whole career in the Confederate Army, and then I'll close it up with his after the war and tell you what he did at the end of his life. But again, thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already, go ahead and give some of the other episodes a listen, and consider joining the Patreon and follow the Instagram page if you have not already. I try to post updates there every now and again. If anything comes out, it all gets posted there. And yeah, thanks you guys for supporting the show, and I'll see you next time.